As Christ Community Church celebrates its 40th year, founding pastor Jim Nicodem has shared a series of talks with church staff about how God has been on the move over 4 decades. These are not meant to be sermons or in-depth theological studies, but instead are stories and reflections from a founding pastor. We now invite you to listen in as Pastor Jim shares what has been and what will continue to be the core legacy values of Christ Community Church.
You've probably heard the saying, money makes the world go round. And you know it doesn't. That's not true. But it is true that our lives tend to revolve around money, right? A lot of our time and effort goes into making money, spending money, budgeting money, investing money, giving money, worrying about money. No doubt this is why God's word has so much to say about the topic of money and possessions. Someone has said that there is more in the Bible about money and possessions than there is about faith, prayer, heaven. I've never stopped to count up all the passages to see if this is true, but I'll take their word for it. 1 out of every 10 verses in the New Testament is about money and possessions. 1/3 of Jesus' parables is about this topic. So welcome to the 7th installment in a series of talks that I've been giving at staff lunches over the past year and a half called Legacy Values. And our key verse for this series is 1 Corinthians 3, verse 10, where the Apostle Paul says, I laid a foundation as a wise builder. Others are building on it. Be careful of how you build. By God's grace, Sue and I arrived in town a little over 39 years ago, and on December 16th, which we celebrated this last weekend, was our very first service. And so I was thinking, that was Saturday this year. I was thinking on Friday on my day off, 39 years ago, I had absolutely no idea who was going to show up at our rented movie theater. You know, I had no idea whether it was going to be 20 people or there was going to be 50 people. It turned out to be 120 people. We had done canvassing of thousands of homes, just going door to door and inviting people to a church that didn't exist, and a lot of them decided to show up. And so now having laid the foundation, I'm passing the baton, as Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 3:10. I'm passing the baton on to you. So here are the values that God has built into my life, into Sue's life, that we've tried to teach faithfully to the church. My hope and my prayer is that you own these values and that God fleshes them out in your life and that you impart them to the church in the years to come. So today, the legacy value that we're going to talk about is stewardship. And I know I'll say it right up front, stewardship is more than what we do with our money. Okay, stewardship covers how we manage our time, how we manage our spiritual gifts and talents, how we manage our relationships. But today we're just going to focus on money. And not only is this an incredibly important topic, it's a really, really important legacy value at Christ Community Church. It has been from the beginning. So today I want to talk about 4 aspects of stewardship that are central to our ministry. And again, these are values I hope you imbibe, you own, and you pass on to others. So number 1 aspect is that this is a key to discipleship. Stewardship is a key to discipleship. When we launched Christ Community in a rented movie theater on December 16th, 1984, our goal at weekend services was to reach unchurched people. And we had a prototype. It was unchurched Harry and Mary. So we had worked this out, what are unchurched Harry and Mary, what do they look like? What are their preferences? What do they think about church? We had done all of our thinking and praying around this. And one of the things we knew for certain is that unchurched Harry and Mary were turned off to church because of appeals to give. And this makes sense, right? I mean, it's an obvious thing. If you've got unchurched friends, I was thinking about a couple that's just down the block from us on Maple Lane in Batavia, Earl and Carol. We've gotten to know them for several years. We've shared the gospel with them numerous times. We've invited them to church. No interest at all, which is ironic because Earl grew up headed toward the priesthood. Very devout Catholic young man, but then he met Carol and decided to get married instead of becoming a priest, but continued on as a very loyal Catholic, moved to our block, Maple Lane, started attending the local Catholic church. They'd gone 2 or 3 times, and a priest was dispatched to go to their house to welcome them to the community and to tell them how much the church expected them to give. That was all Earl needed to hear. That was the last time he ever set foot in that church or any other church. And he's told me, that was it for church and me. So we could figure this out. So we decided at the beginning of Christ Community, we needed to really downplay the offering spot in our service. So we always prefaced it, and this went on for years. Week after week, we always said the same thing before the offering. If you're a guest here, please feel no obligation to give. If you're a regular part of our community, then we invite your generosity. But yeah, we always invited people not to give. But over time, I began to question this approach to stewardship. And it wasn't because we were running into financial problems. We were actually doing really good. It had more to do with the fact that as I was digging deeper into the Bible, I saw how much the Bible has to say about money. One verse in particular has been kind of a North Star for me, and that is Luke 16, verse 11. Jesus says, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? If you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, in other words, if you're not managing your money in a godly fashion, who's going to trust you? Is God really going to trust you with true spiritual riches? And so I saw in that verse that people's spiritual growth depends on how they're stewarding their money. The bottom line is they're not going to grow until they get this giving thing down. Practically speaking, I could tell you that over almost 4 decades now of doing pastoral work, this is constantly played out in the lives of people I see at the church. When they start giving, it's like a rocket fuel. It's like their spiritual life just takes off. And conversely, when I see people who are involved in ministry and they're in groups and they're serving but if they're not givers, I see their spiritual lives limp along. And I just want to underscore this, especially for those of you whose role involves discipling people. So if you're a community group leader, or you're working in Rooted with new believers, or you're in student ministries, don't miss the importance of this principle here. I mean, I can't emphasize it enough. In fact, I would go so far as to say that given our materialistic culture in which people's lives revolve around money, the most important aspect of their spiritual growth is going to be stewardship. Now, at this point, I should just stop and hand the mic to Larry Stratton and let him take it from here as our generosity pastor, but I expected at least an amen from you when I said that. Yes, okay, yes. I mean that, you guys. I can't think of another catalytic element of spiritual growth that I would consider more important than stewardship when it comes to people taking off. I've just seen it happen with such regularity that when people get the giving thing down, boom, they just take off. So we started teaching regular sermon series on the topic, which we do to this day. Every 12 to 18 months. Our last one was Me and My Paycheck back in spring of this current year. And then we launched a well-respected stewardship coaching ministry. So a few years ago, then we added a generosity pastor. Larry, I already mentioned that he's come on board. This is just a super important value of ours. The Bible's most familiar verse, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he what? Gave. That's the verb, gave. So as we're growing people into greater and greater Christ-likeness, generosity, it's just got to be on the palate. Now, let me move on to a second aspect of stewardship. So the first one is a key to discipleship. I want to talk about stewardship in terms of a baseline of tithing. You're probably aware that Christ Community Church has a number of position papers that spell out our church's perspective on a wide variety of potentially contentious doctrinal issues. So we have position papers on the end times. We have a position paper on sexuality, one on the gospel, one on women in leadership, one on marriage and divorce, one on creation. But guess what our very first position paper was on? It was on tithing. Tithing. So we had been teaching tithing as a baseline for giving. You know, that you give a tenth. You give the first 10% of your paycheck right off the top to the Lord's work. But occasionally we were running into people who were objecting. And it would typically happen after one of our stewardship sermon series. We would get word back from community group leaders like, oh, that didn't go over well. So some of the people in our group objected. And here's the way the objection was most commonly voiced. It was, tithing is an Old Testament law. It's not for New Testament believers. You ever heard that one? And so we thought, well, you know, we need to dig into this. We need to see what the biblical basis is. And one of the first things we discovered is that it's true that it's included in the Old Testament law that Moses received from God. However, okay, it predates the law by 600 years. The first tither in the Bible is not Moses. Who's the first tither in the Bible? Abraham. 2000 BC. Moses comes along around 1400 BC. So we saw that the principle of giving God 10% goes all the way back to Abraham. And again, people would object and they say, yeah, but it's not emphasized in the New Testament. That's correct. You don't see it hugely emphasized. But we ask the question, but does the New Testament abolish it? Does the New Testament say this is now a dated principle? This is for Old Testament believers, New Testament believers. We've got to do, no, it's never said that way. In fact, Jesus said to the Pharisees on one occasion, he said, there are some basic laws about loving neighbors and whatever that you guys miss completely. Now, you got the tithing thing down really well. But he says in Matthew 23:23, he says, you should do the big commandments without giving up, without neglecting that tithing bit. So given the fact that the first century church was Jewish, I think we can expect that it was kind of taken for granted that the giving disciplines of giving that first tithe back to the Lord was probably part and parcel of early church life. Again, some people would respond and they would say, well, yeah, but Paul tells the Corinthians, and this is 2 Corinthians 9, verse 7, and I quote, each person should give what they've decided in their heart to give. So you see, there's no set amount, there's no baseline, it's just however God moves your heart. Okay, but what they failed to cite was the fact that in the context of that verse, Paul wasn't talking about regular giving. Paul was talking about an offering he was collecting for the poor in Jerusalem, and he was saying, listen, this is an over and above kind of thing. So before you give, pray about it, and then you just give as generously as God leads you to give. So this doesn't, again, undo the biblical principle of tithing. Well, one final thought, and then I'm going to move to the positive side of what I think tithing helps us accomplish. But one of the things I noticed over the years was that none of the people who objected to the law's standard of 10%, none of them objected because they thought it was too low. It wasn't like, okay, well now since Jesus has come and God has lavished us with his grace, we ought to be giving like 15 or 20. No, it was like, this is an Old Testament law, so now I should be able to give 3% or 5% or really? Hey, if we live in an age of grace and you want to give over and above, yes, that's definitely a New Testament principle in terms of generosity. But let me tell you the positive side of tithing. And you'll see this in our position paper if you want to take a closer look at it. 5 things here that tithing does. Tithing is an act of obedience. And I just want to say, I get tired of hearing believers object to obedience by calling it legalism. That's the easiest way to discount anything God asks us to do. Well, let's not get legalistic about it. Obedience is obedience. And it's an important principle for our Christian lives. And Jesus says, if you love me, you'll obey me. And when you do obey me, you're showing that you love me. So no, the motivation ought not to be that someone's got a gun to your head to give your 10%. The motivation ought to be because I love God. But the baseline is that obedience of 10%. And then secondly, Tithing says God owns it all. So please understand, it's not like, well, if I give my 10% to God, then the 90% is left for me. It's not what it means at all. The whole thing belongs to God. With the first 10%, when you give that tithe, it says, God, I recognize that you own it all. In fact, the prophet Malachi says, Malachi 3 verse 8, he says, if you're not tithing, you're what? Robbing God. That's really strong language. Third thing I want to say about tithing on a positive note, tithing demonstrates trust. And I've watched this play out in people's lives over the years. You know, you typically think of those who don't have a whole lot of money, how they need to trust God to give a tithe because they could barely make ends meet and pay the bills and whatever. And now you're saying the first 10% goes to God. You know, and it's true. People at that end of the pendulum, it's a matter of, can you trust God? That if you give him the 10%, God's going to make the 90% left stretch to cover your needs. But I found over the years that people who make boku bucks at the other end of the spectrum, it's a trust issue too. Because let's say you make $200,000 a year. Well, the tithe on that is $20,000. You come to the end of the year and you look and you say, we gave away $20,000. You know what we could have done with that money? You know the vacation trips we could have taken, or we could have bought an extra car, used car for one of our teens, or any number of things. $20,000. I find that sometimes it's harder for people who make a lot of money to trust God in this. You know, Rockefeller, the original dude who was known for his charity, he was once asked, how is it that you've been able to give away millions of dollars? And he said, it's because I gave away my first buck. So he started when it was small, and he made it a matter of regular, obedient giving. So it demonstrates trust. Fourth thing I want to say about it, it reflects belonging. You know, what were the original Old Testament tithes used for? There was an over and above tithe that was used for the poor, but the basic tithe, according to Numbers 18, verse 21, and I read, I give to the Levites, the priests, all the tithes in Israel as their inheritance in return for the work they do while serving at the tent of meeting. In other words, the tithes in Old Testament times paid for the church staff. And one of the things we teach people around here is that it's not just that the first 10% of your income goes back to the Lord, but it should go back to your local church. Okay, so there are other organizations that you may want to support over and above that, Samaritan's Purse or a personal missionary friend that you've got. But that first 10%, you belong to a family, and the family's got bills to pay, and you wouldn't think very highly of a dad whose kids were starving while he was bringing bags of groceries to neighbors down the street. Okay, he's got a responsibility for his own family. And so we just believe strongly and that it accords with Scripture that the tithe belongs to the church. Fifth insight, tithing is a baseline. You know, it's just where you begin. It's not the end goal. It's the starting point. And it's so easy to compute. Right? A tithe is so easy. You don't have to worry about, what's it going to be? Just look at your paycheck and move the decimal, one place to the left. That's a tithe. That goes back to the Lord automatically. Okay, so tithing. We've taught tithing. We got a white paper on tithing. If you run into people who have a grumpy attitude about tithing, feel free to refer them to that paper. Number third thing I want to say about this financial stewardship. It's a requirement of leaders. Now, I got to tell you my first experience in this regard. So I started out in ministry as a youth pastor in a teeny-weeny church on the south side of Boston. And we began with like 20 middle school and high school students. And by God's grace, I've told this before, by God's grace, in the first year and a half, we had ballooned to like 200 students coming. And so we were planning an outreach, and I wanted to know what the kids thought would be a good idea for an outreach. So we gathered our leaders together. We had divided our high school ministry into 4 teams, and every team, we didn't have staff. We didn't have paid staff except me. We didn't even have adult volunteers yet at the time because the ministry had kind of grown so quickly. So Sue was discipling 4 high school girls, and I was discipling 4 high school young men, and they were the leaders of the team. So we got these 8 young people together and said, what do you think we ought to do for an outreach? And they said, oh, Christian rock band. Yeah, let's do a concert. So I said, okay, well, you realize like there's no money. The church has no money for something like this. And we looked into a couple of bands, and, bands at that time, Christian bands weren't traveling to New England. And so it's going to cost us a little bit of money to get them here, like in the hundreds, maybe even the thousands of dollars. And they said, we could pay for it. I said, okay, we can pay for it. So let's do it. And so we gave an envelope to every one of the high school students, and we said, fill it and turn it in. Let's see how we do. And I'll never forget the accounting. I'm opening up the envelopes, and I open up one from John. And John had come to Christ through our ministry in the previous year. He was one of our male leaders. And I knew that the minute this thing was launched, he was out there doing odd jobs and, extra work. He had a part-time job and whatever. And I opened up $200 in that envelope from a high school student. And I'm thinking, this is really cool. I reached for the next envelope. It's from Leslie. Leslie's one of our female leaders. Now, Leslie was a mall rat. And if you ever saw Leslie at the mall, she always had like 5 or 6 shopping bags, filled with stuff that she bought for herself. So I'm thinking, Leslie's loaded. This is going to be good. And I open it up, and it's a $10 bill. And I'm thinking, Leslie spends more on lip gloss, I'm sure, than what's in this envelope. Are you kidding me? And I just, I learned from that experience that maturing leaders' lives are marked by generosity. Leaders are marked by generosity. This principle was driven home to me a few years later. So fast forward from student ministries, now I'm starting Christ Community Church, and in our early years we're experiencing some growth, and I'm thinking, I don't know what to do next. But there are all these mega churches out in the Southern California. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to visit about 5 or 6 of these mega churches and find out how they're doing it. So I did a self-funded, go by myself trip to Southern California. Before I went, I called these churches ahead of time and said, is there somebody on your staff that could sit down with me and just explain to me what's growing in your church? Only one of the churches said, yeah, our senior pastor will do that. Only one. No senior pastor was going to be bothered by me. But John Maxwell said, oh, I'd love to meet with you. If you've never met John, John is like enthusiasm personified. He is the leadership guru of gurus. I don't know how many books on leadership he's written, but I will never forget what he said to me. I could still picture his office. I could picture the love seat, the leather love seat I sat in, and John looking me in the eye, and he says, you got to know what your leaders are giving. And I thought to myself, wow, that was a revolutionary thought back then, because it was just assumed that pastors were not to know what anybody in their church gave, because if you knew what somebody gave and they gave a lot of money, you might be tempted to show favoritism toward them. By the way, just a side note here, I have never found that I've been tempted to show favoritism. In fact, I could give you illustrations of having to go toe-to-toe and get in the face of some really large givers when there was stuff going on in their life that needed to be corrected. So, nobody gets a pane of glass etched with their name in it, or, a room of the church named after them, or whatever. But this was a revolutionary principle, to think that you ought to know what the leaders in your church are giving. And Maxwell made the point this way. He used a verse that I know is a favorite verse of Clayton's, as it is of mine. And that is the verse where Jesus says that your heart is always going to follow your treasure. Your heart's going to be where your treasure is. So Maxwell said to me, he said, if people's treasure is not in your church, if they're not investing financially in your church, I got news for you, their heart's not there either. Boy, I found that out the hard way over years and years of ministry. There would be people who would leave on occasion because they'd get upset about this or that. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, they're a leader. I can't believe they're leaving. And then you look at the track record of their giving and it's, oh, they never gave a whole lot. They were never really invested here. And so we began the practice of checking out what people gave before putting them in leadership. This is a practice that we still engage in today. When someone is named as a candidate for elder or trustee or, community group leader or ministry director, one of the first things we check is, are they giving? And not nickel and diming, but do they give what looks to be like something that represents maybe a tithe for a regular sized salary in this area? This would be a good time for me to underscore what I consider to be the most important aspect of leadership in general, and you've heard me say this many, many times. What are leaders in the church called to do? What does Peter say is our number one job? Those of you who are pastors, 1 Peter chapter 5. What's the most important thing for you to do? We lead by example. Peter says, hey, pastors, your job is not to make decisions and enforce them, and lord it over others. Peter says, your job is to lead by example. Your job is to be a role model. So when it comes to giving, this is so important. Especially, again, those of you who are on the pastoral staff, if your number one job is to be a role model, you got to be a role model when it comes to stewardship. We've been through 5 or 6 capital campaigns as a church. And I know every time we begin a capital campaign, I know what this is going to mean for me, for Sue and me. Because I know in my heart that if I haven't given the most generous gift I could possibly give, it's impossible for me to expect that God's going to move in other people's lives to do the same. And it's not because we broadcast it. It's not because we put in print what Pastor Jim's giving, but God knows. God knows. God knows what you give. God knows what you give. And by the way, can I just say this kind of tongue in cheek? We know what you give too. So, it's real interesting. There are a lot of things, those of you who are leaders, there are a lot of things we don't know about your life with respect to spiritual disciplines. Okay, we don't know how much you pray. We don't know if you're a loving, supportive spouse. We don't know. We're not in your house. We don't know how often you share the gospel. One of the things we do know is because we got the record, we know what you give or don't give. And I'd say, hey, come on, let's be role models with this aspect of giving. You get it? Good. I've never done that with staff, so it was kind of fun to try that. David did this. By the way, if you're looking for an Old Testament or a biblical precedent in the Old Testament, David was raising money, resources for the temple that his son Solomon was going to build. And David was right out there. You could read it in Chronicles for yourself. He told the people, this is what I've given. So here's my track record. I'm not asking you to do anything I wouldn't do myself. And in that Chronicles passage, the people are so inspired by the example of their leaders that they give generously. Okay, here's a fourth aspect of stewardship. I call it a big challenge to break the ice. A big challenge to break the ice. Some of you have heard me tell this story before, but this is a legacy values series, so I get to tell the same old stories again and again. Some of you have heard this 20 or 30 times, but in the early days of the church, when we were meeting in a movie theater, we were sort of maxing it out. We rented this movie theater, and across the parking lot was a KinderCare facility, and that's what we used for children's ministry. And every year, KinderCare would come to us when it was time to renew the contract, and they would say, you guys got to go. We're sorry, but our lawyer tells us it's not good to have the liability of people in the building over the weekend. And we would pray, and then say, please, please, please. And they would say, okay, one more year. And then we'd sign the contract and we'd have one more year. And the next year, the same thing would happen. They'd say, no, you guys are out. Our lawyers say no more. Say, oh, come on, please, please, please. And they'd say, well, okay. And we'd sign it until 1 year, it didn't happen. 1 year they said to us, this was 5-6 years into it, they said, no, this is it, we're done. Okay, we'll sign the contract for this year, but when this year's over, you guys got to be out of here. We had just purchased 40 acres of land at the corner of Balcom and Randall Road. We were tapped out. We had raised thousands of dollars to buy this piece of property. And now we had to go back to our congregation and say, okay, we got 1 year to put a building on this property. Which means building's got to start pretty doggone soon, which means we got to have money to do the building. Now, we could borrow a good chunk of the money, which we knew we could, but we need $250,000, $250,000, which was an astronomical amount to us, in order to turn the key on the loan, to hire the architect and the construction company and whatever. So we've got 1 month in which to raise this, okay? Otherwise, we can't meet the deadlines. We're out on our keisters and we've got nowhere to go. By this time, the church is running 600-700 people. It's not like you could just move it to the Veterans Hall or something, And so the last day of the month came. Well, let me back it up for a moment. $250,000. One of the first things God did in answer to that prayer, he raised up an anonymous donor who demanded anonymity, which is why to this day I have no idea who the person was. But it was like, oh, thank you, God. So it's not $250, it's now $125,000. But we got to the last date of the month that if we didn't have the money, we couldn't turn the key on the loan. We were up to $90,000, $35,000 short. By the way, sometimes I tell this story, I get my numbers mixed up. So if you ever hear me say other numbers, go with these numbers, So we had $35,000 to go. It was a Wednesday night. Back then we had midweek services at a rented Lutheran church. And at the beginning of the worship service, we said to everybody, we're going to take the offering at the beginning. Don't typically do this in a church service, but we're going to count it during the service so that we can let you know whether we made it or not. And so at the end of the night, I was handed an envelope with a piece of paper in it. And all I wanted to see is that we'd gone from $90,000 to $120,000, $125,000. And I opened it up and we'd gone from $90,000 to $180,000, which were going to be matched dollar for dollar by the matching gift. It was $360,000, right? You mathematicians. It represented $360,000. And that has been, that has been our track record over the years. When people are challenged to give super generously, and it's a really, really good cause, they rally. They just do. These big giving extravaganzas that we've got. Non-givers become givers for the first time. Okay, this cause really moves me. And they break the ice and they find it's not painful, it's joyful. Token givers start becoming regular givers. Tithers start giving over and above. People whom God has blessed to make beaucoup bucks at their business. They wake up to the reality, the reason God allows me to make all this money is not just for better vacation trips for my family. It's so that I can resource God's work. So here's something I've learned about myself as we've faced these financial campaigns and these year-end gifts. Beforehand, I'm always wishing we didn't have to do it. Because I know what lies in front of us. I know it's going to be so time-consuming and energy-intensive, and I know that non-givers are going to bug the heck out of me. When I see that they're not even participating, and so if I could ahead of time, I would wave a magic wand, and the money we needed would just appear. But afterwards, I am always ecstatic. Not only because we've achieved the unbelievable, not only because we built a new building, a new facility for the DeKalb campus, or we funded audio Bibles in 25 brand new languages, but we also saw people jump into the deep end of the generosity pool. And as a result, spiritual lives are now taking off rockets. And I've actually come to the place of saying, you know what? If we didn't have a good reason to do a capital campaign, I'd make one up. Because it would just be so worthwhile. As painful as it is to ramp up to it, it is so worthwhile to see people become givers and as a result, see them grow just tremendously in their relationship with Jesus. My two favorite kind of testimonials to hear around our church, number one is without a doubt when I hear about a person who surrendered their life to Christ. Like hearing the dude's video this weekend before the baptisms, I'm standing at the back and I'm just crying and, so lovely, so lovely. Second favorite kind of testimony is when I hear someone talk about how God got a hold of their money and they became a giver and how their spiritual life just took off. It is such a joy. And let me close with that thought. Generous people are joyful people. And a generous church is a joy-filled church. This is why it's so important, you guys, that this legacy value lives on and that we even build upon it at Christ Community Church. A generous church is a joy-filled church. It really is. And Sue and I sat at our kitchen table this last Sunday night. And she got out her laptop, and we just needed to do a check-in on our giving for the year, for 2023. And so we first wanted to make sure that we had been faithful, that we had been tithing and given a first 10% of our paycheck back to the church. And then secondly, we wanted to make sure that we were giving the biggest, hugest year-end gift for training tomorrow's leaders that we could possibly give. Okay, and then we did that, and then we looked and we said, we still got some more money here. So it's been our goal for a number of years now to give at least 20% of our income to the Lord's work because we just love it. It's a blast. So before the night was out, we had sent money to SBR because I love SBR and what it's done for our student ministry. And I was there in junior high when they first opened their doors. I was a junior high student at SBR. You know, back then there weren't cabins and stuff. You just had to kill your own meat. And then we sent another bunch of money to Voice of the Martyrs because I really care about persecuted brothers and sisters. And we sent a bunch of money to crisis pregnancy centers because that's a really important cause that we believe in. And we sent some money to Chicago Hope Academy. If you don't know about Chicago Hope, I interviewed for an Inspiring Stories weekend a few years ago, Bob Musikowski, who started that whole thing for inner city minority students, training them to be Christian leaders. Great. So we sent a bunch of those. When we closed up that laptop, it was like, that was a blast. That was a blast. You know, if you have not gotten bit by the generosity bug yet, you just don't know what you're missing in terms of joy. So I say, let's become a generous church because we're going to be a joy-filled church.
Thanks for joining us for this Legacy Value series. Check out the rest of these podcasts at ccclife.org/podcasts.